Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Tea Time Thoughts. I'm Kaylin, and I'm very excited this week because we have our first guest, and I just want to introduce her to you guys. This is my friend Chlöe Harris, and Chlöe, thank you so much for coming on the show. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I'm really excited to be here. I am a big fan of the podcast, and I love what we're talking about today. So I am glad to join you today. And, well, Kaylin and I know each other back from college.
Yeah, so like Chlöe said, we met when we were in college in Rexburg together. And so today we're going to be talking about the movie JoJo Rabbit by Taika Watiti. And this is a movie actually that Chlöe and I talked about going to see in theaters together, but schedule-wise, we just kind of got busy, and, Chloe's kind of a mastermind, so she's out studying all these different languages and painting like glorious portraits of people. So being master of the universe is a pretty busy job, but I'm very
kind as always.
I'm very glad at least that we're going to be able to discuss it now, because I had a lot of fun like getting this all set up, and I'm really excited to hear about what Chlöe has to tell us. So
when I initially heard about the movie, I wanted to hear your thoughts about it. So I'm glad that we're finally able to do that.
Me too. So first things first, tell me what kind of tea you're drinking today, because I'm very curious about it.
So anyone knows me, they know that I'm really extra. So I can't just make a normal tea. So I have an apple cinnamon tea that I added honey, nutmeg, and heavy whipping cream to. So it tastes really, it's like a really fancy apple cider that I'm drinking right now, but I love it.
That sounds so good. I put a tea bag in water, and that was my special recipe. I'm having I'm having raspberry zinger tea, but after
I'm sure that's delicious too.
It is tasty, but after like discussing, putting cream in tea with you, I really want to give that a try sometime, because I have like a vanilla chamomile somewhere. I think that would be really good with.
So good with some cream in it.
Yeah, I'm totally gonna have to experiment with that sometime.
Tell me how it goes.
Oh yeah, for sure. All right, so let's get into it. So we should probably start by kind of summarizing JoJo Rabbit a little bit. So how would you describe it?
So JoJo Rabbit is a movie set during World War II, during Nazi Germany. And it is all through the perspective of a 10-year-old boy. His name is Johannes, or JoJo for short. And it just kind of goes throughout his life of, well, more or less being a Nazi in Germany.
And one thing that's really interesting too is, even though JoJo's like trying to sort of be this like picture perfect Hitler Youth boy, he finds out that his mom is hiding a Jewish girl in their house named Elsa. So that kind of creates like the main conflict of the story, because he eventually becomes friends with Elsa, and so he's like, is it the right thing to do to follow Hitler, or is it better to ignore that and kind of focus on what my conscience says? And then one of my favorite parts of the whole thing is Taika Watiti himself stars as Hitler. And Hitler in this movie, he's kind of like JoJo's imaginary friend. So it's Hitler, but also like a 10-year-old boy's perspective of Hitler.
The first time I watched it, I actually didn't realize that it was Taika Watiti playing Hitler. And so I was watching it, and I was like, I can't believe someone agreed to do that within the first 10 minutes of the movie, because like, it's a bit shocking. But when I watched it again, I was like, oh, this just fits so perfectly.
Mm-hmm. I don't know. As a creator, too, he's very interesting. He's willing to sort of explore different areas. And I think Hitler's an area that it's kind of something that everyone agrees on. Like, Hitler is bad, and that's pretty much the only...
There's no argument.
Oh, yeah.
Any other direction. It is Hitler is bad.
Yeah, like I remember when I was a kid in 7th grade, when we were kind of first studying World War II, Hitler used to scare me so much that I would like put my history textbook outside of my bedroom when I slept. Because I wanted everything to like totally be separated. But I don't know, this movie kind of brings him to light in a very interesting way. Obviously, like, the portrayal that we see of him isn't based on any historical record, but it's still something that's really interesting.
Well, and one thing that I love that the film has done is Taika Watiti has such an interesting perspective of how to film it. It honestly, within watching it, it reminded me of a Wes Anderson film, kind of like Moonrise Kingdom or even Fantastic Mr. Fox. with how some of the shots were done. For example, like when JoJo is realizing he has feelings for Elsa, they do a shot of his stomach and there's a bunch of butterflies over top of it. And I just thought that was a charming, cute way to show that.
Yeah, I loved that.
Or another shot, or it's just like multiple shots throughout the whole film was the significance of the mother's red shoes. Always alluded to, like it was panned down and showed the shoes in a way that you knew that they would be important later, but it didn't give all the information away too quickly. And once you did finally see the red shoes in the moment of like the climax of their importance, you knew exactly whose shoes they were and what the meaning behind it was.
Mm-hmm. That was, oh my gosh, that was just so well done. I'm glad that you brought that up because I think that was so impressive and a very powerful way to kind of shift into a plot of the movie in a very subtle way. And like you said, it was very powerful once we like realized what was going on.
Mm-hmm. And it was honestly a beautiful scene where they didn't have any dialogue throughout it. And they didn't need it because it was that powerful on its own. And I honestly think if there was dialogue throughout that scene, it would have taken away from the power that it had.
I agree for sure. So one of the first questions I wanted to ask you too, so now that we've like discussed it a little bit more, what was one of your favorite parts of the movie?
That is a good question. It's hard to pinpoint a favorite scene because I love this movie. I could tell you some of my favorite characters. I really like Rosie's character. I felt like she was really needed because without her, there wouldn't be any problem or anything pushing JoJo to be better.
I agree with that. I also think like her personality as a character is really interesting too because JoJo, even though he is a child, he's still really focusing on becoming the best that he can be and stuff. But Rosie's the one that's going around and reminding him to let himself be a kid and to just sort of be happy with stuff. She's making jokes a lot, even though they're in the middle of a really terrible world war. And they're also in one of the like most awful parts of it too. They're right at the end. Everyone is going hungry. Their food is being very severely rationed, but she's still playing music and records and
dancing.
Yeah.
I love how dancing is so associated with her, how she's like, be happy, you need to dance, you need to like have this happiness not only with JoJo but with Elsa as well. She's like, be a woman, dance.
Yeah, I loved that. One part that I really liked too was, like you said, this dancing motif kind of keeps being brought up. So at the end, when they're looking around and the war is over, we end it with a dancing scene that's pretty lighthearted. And it kind of starts sort of slow too. They're just sort of like rocking back and forth a bit, but then they really get into it and it kind of brings things to a nice close.
And it's such a cute dance scene between the two of them.
It is. As far as the next question, a lot of people thought this movie was kind of controversial because especially with JoJo having Hitler as an imaginary friend, they thought that it was perhaps portraying Hitler in a light that he didn't deserve to have. And
as if it was almost irreverent.
Yeah, exactly. And, you know, there are parts of the movie that are irreverent and stuff, but that's just part of the comedy and part of the directing style as well. But it's interesting seeing a war movie from the perspective of a child in a way that isn't done in a very serious manner. I feel like if we see a movie like The Book Thief, for instance, it's always told in a very solemn manner. Like death is telling Liesel's story throughout The Book Thief. So it's interesting to have this movie take place in like one of the darkest periods in history where a boy is still just kind of growing up and living like a child is. So what do you think the impact is of showing 10-year-old JoJo's perspective of World War II?
Do you know the movie Life is Beautiful?
No, actually. Tell me a little bit about that.
So Life is Beautiful is another comedy set during World War II. But there's not a lot of dialogue throughout it, and you can find it dubbed or subbed really easily. But it is set from the perspective of this Jewish father and his son. They end up getting taken to a concentration camp. And the majority of the movie is a comedy. So when I was watching JoJo Rabbit again, I thought of Life is Beautiful throughout several different parts of it and just how it was kind of similar how they decided to make it a comedy. And Life is Beautiful also has a very powerful ending as well. So it has those similar elements as JoJo Rabbit, and I thought it'd be interesting to compare the two. And honestly, I want to watch them both back to back and see how easily they do compared to each other.
I'd like to watch that too, because I've never heard of that before, but that sounds really interesting.
It really is such a good movie, and it is a tearjerker. Like, it will make you cry, but I mean, I feel like JoJo Rabbit is the same way as well.
Mm-hmm.
But throughout the whole thing, the father is taking care of, I want to say his son is like 3 or 4. And of course, the 3 or 4-year-old isn't going to know what's going on. So the father is trying to make jokes or try to make it happy for his son, who happens to be living in a concentration camp. Like, they're both about World War II, and they're both, I feel like they're different parts of World War II, whereas like one is more of like Hitler's youth and the Nazis, and the other is more like concentration camps and Holocaust.
That's interesting, because thinking about it, like when you bring that up, we don't really see a lot of allusions to the Holocaust in JoJo Rabbit, except for when Elsa is talking about the last time she saw her parents and saying that they went to a place that you don't come back from. I found it interesting that, you know, maybe her character couldn't quite talk about it because it was something that was difficult for her to talk about, which could absolutely be the case, because I can't imagine what it would be like to have to grapple with that kind of reality. But I wonder too if she didn't quite tell JoJo about that because he's still a young boy, and that would be something that would be very difficult to come to terms with as a child.
Yeah, I actually think that definitely goes towards the impact of a child's perspective during World War II, because I feel like a 10-year-old child wouldn't be able to understand the significance of the events that happened in the Holocaust or why they happened. I think that a 10-year-old would be more concerned about, honestly, how their images or their popularity throughout things. And I know that increases more as you get in age, but I think a 10-year-old at that point would be worried more so about themselves than they would about other sort of events.
I'm glad that you brought up that point too, because in the very beginning of the movie, he's kind of hyping himself up to be the best that he can. He's like, I have the mind of a wolf, or like heart of a lion or something, the blood of a German. And then when he's confronted with his first sort of conflict of whether or not to kill the rabbit that the older boys have given to him, you can see how much he doesn't actually want to do something like that. He can kind of start to see a bit of the lines of where right and wrong are, but...
And where his loyalty falls. Because throughout the whole film, his mother is saying, like, oh, he would understand, like, it took him forever to get over the fact that his grandfather wasn't blonde, or he was just such a Nazi. Whereas throughout the film, you see that's not actually how he identifies as, and that his loyalties change throughout the movie.
I think, too, that, like, I know when I was a kid, if we ever saw, like, portrayals of Hitler Youth in textbooks or documentaries or anything like that, we tend to kind of group them along with the rest of the Nazi party. We're like, oh, man, look at these evil little kids that were definitely no good. But especially watching this, it kind of reminds you, like, they're just kids, and they're not focused on like all these grand schemes of the world. The world that a kid lives in is a lot smaller in scope. I actually have a statistic here. So the Hitler Youth groups, like the one that JoJo had joined, in 1936 it was law for boys at the age of 10 to attend the organization, and then they would graduate at about the age of 14 or so. And so by the end of that year, there were over 5 million kids that were attending these groups across Germany. So JoJo's story, like, even though the movie focuses solely on him, his situation is relatable to a lot of children during that time period, because when you're in the like camps and stuff, I read some people that had memories of the situation. They said that it was kind of like being in Boy Scouts or like going to girls camp or something. It really wasn't anything that different from like a summer camp that we would go to today. Even when I went to girls camp, they taught us how to shoot rifles.
Well, and I feel like the movie did such a good job of showing that it was more like a summer camp, and rather that they were preparing for war. Because the activities, they were more like, today you're going to learn how to fight, you're going to learn how to throw a grenade. But the way that they went about showing them, and like even with the uniforms they were wearing, it felt very scouty rather than military.
And I think you could tell, too, that Commander K, I can't really pronounce his full name properly, but...
Neither can I. I had to watch that scene so many times to get his name, and I'm like, I still don't know how to pronounce it.
Yeah, so I'm glad he was like, you can call me Commander K, because I'm like, yeah, that's what I'm going to do. I think they could tell, too, that they weren't really taking the boys seriously all that much. Even when JoJo's like, I'm going to write a book about how to identify a Jew, and he just sort of laughs it off and kind of makes fun of him for it. He doesn't really expect things to be taken seriously.
And even like the fact that they had a commander who happened to be injured throughout fighting lead these boys. It seems like it was more of a, not necessarily a joke, but like a scout kind of thing would do, not necessarily someone who is in tip-top fit shape to lead these boys.
That's a really good point. I actually hadn't thought about that. That's a really great observation.
Thank you.
Yeah. One thing that is really interesting too, so Rebel Wilson's character, she's kind of like this ride or die Nazi supporter, and she's very much sort of a fanatic. But when she says in the beginning, like, you know, we're going to teach the girls about how to get pregnant and stuff, and I've had 18 babies for Germany, obviously that's kind of played up to the max because it's, you know, it is satirical, but there is some truth to the sort of doctrine they were giving to the girls, because they're trying to teach the boys how to fight and stuff, and they're trying to teach the girls how to support the boys that are going off to war and how to have children that are going to create this vision of Germany that the Nazi party is trying to create.
Being good German women.
Exactly. So one thing that was really interesting too is Commander K, like, not only is he an officer that's been injured, but throughout the movie we see hints of his homosexuality. And this was something that I found really interesting because Hitler grouped homosexuals with some of his undesirables that he wanted to be extinguished. And I was wondering if maybe you thought that this would provide insight into his character and maybe ultimately why he saves JoJo in the end, because he seems kind of like this guy that is sort of doing his job because he has to. I feel like we get hints of what his character is really like along the way. So what do you think about it?
I agree with you. Actually, even within his first appearance on screen, it seems like he wasn't fully into it. Like his heart wasn't into what he was doing, what his job was. He seems like he was joking around and stuff like that. So I just felt like he wasn't so serious about being a commanding officer.
So I kind of want to draw things back a little bit to the portrayal of Hitler in the movie, because as we said earlier, for the past 80 years or so, he's basically been history's greatest monster. So what do you think about the portrayal of Hitler, and what does it tell us about Germany during that time?
Well, when I first watched the film, my initial reaction of Hitler was, of course, quite startling to see Hitler in a film portrayed that way. But then I was thinking that Hitler in this film is from JoJo's imagination. And when I think about it, I think that Hitler's main use in this film is to be like a father figure to JoJo, because JoJo's father is off fighting the war. And growing up, when you have a father figure, it is like you need father figures to grow up in the home. So I think that JoJo fabricated his own version of Hitler to be his father figure, his imaginary friend, throughout this film, which I feel like we can see several inconsistencies through JoJo's Hitler versus the great monster Hitler that we know throughout history. One of these being, throughout the movie, like you can see Hitler eating a unicorn, which is not realistic in any way, shape, or form. So it's just like little inconsistencies like that that don't quite show Hitler as he actually was.
I'm glad that you brought up the inconsistencies as well, because I feel like at some point in the movie, like you said, we kind of see this convergence with the Hitler that we know and the Hitler JoJo knows, because there's this one scene where he really kind of starts to yell at JoJo, and he sounds like, the shouty, angry leader that we all see in the documentaries, where he's screaming into the mic and he's all sweaty and he just looks angry. And it was kind of scary to watch that, just thinking, oh my gosh, he's yelling at a kid this way, and because we're imagining the monster Hitler that we know kind of going off at some kid, and that was one of the parts that had kind of spooked me a bit more in the movie. And I think it's interesting too that you mentioned it was kind of uncomfortable to see Hitler portrayed in something of a childlike way, because we get really uncomfortable with humanizing Hitler. I think that, for instance, there was this clip I saw a while ago, he was talking to a camera woman that was filming something, and he said something like, "Oh, why are you filming a bunch of old men? We should be filming you," something like that. And it's kind of uncomfortable to watch, because who wants to see Hitler flirt with some young woman? That's something that he shouldn't be doing. But somebody had brought up this really excellent point that we get really uncomfortable to have Hitler humanized, because we kind of have to reconcile with the fact that there is a certain point for people where they can be brought to do terrible things, and that I'm imagining too, especially in the beginning, Hitler had good ideals and had an idea of right and wrong, but along the way things changed for him. So it's kind of scary that
and he pushed it way too far.
Yeah, exactly.
I was actually watching an interview. This is a little bit of a different topic, but I was watching an interview with Taika Watiti, who plays Hitler in the film, and they were originally wanting an A-lister actor to play Hitler, but Fox Spotlight producers said that they would not produce the film unless Taika Watiti played Hitler. And the reason for that was because no A-lister would agree to play Hitler, because CM is such a monster. No one wants to humanize that. And no one wants to be known for their role as Hitler in a movie or a film.
That's a really good point, because I'm trying to think. I don't think I could name anybody aside from Taika Waititi that has played Hitler in anything.
And honestly, I feel like Taika Waititi really pulled it off, because, as we know, the film's version of Hitler and history's Hitler are different images. And I feel like because Taika Waititi knew what he was writing about, he was the only one who could really portray Hitler in the right way for this film.
That's a really good point. I think that sometimes to get people to play these characters, you need somebody who's almost the exact opposite of them. Like, I remember when Angelina Jolie said she was casting somebody to play the Japanese guard called the Bird in Unbroken, she was looking for somebody that was almost the exact opposite of who he was in real life. She picked a man who was a very charismatic and kind and funny Japanese pop star to play it, and he brought a lot of life into that role.
That's really interesting. Yeah. I hadn't heard that before.
Yeah, I think it's interesting too, because I imagine there's a lot of challenge to bringing a cruel person to life in some media portrayal. I imagine that there's probably some guilt that goes into it, because you don't usually want to associate yourselves with those people. So it's an interesting concept to think about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure.
All right, so another question I had for you. We see JoJo handing out propaganda flyers and stuff like that. I think propaganda really played a big role in World War II. It's something we think about a lot, but we usually kind of think of propaganda posters or films that are kind of geared towards older people. We don't really think about how propaganda was aimed at children, but how do you think we see propaganda affecting kids throughout the movie?
That's such a great question. Well, I think that we know that one of Hitler's strategies was to target the youth. To help create Hitler's youth, he used lots of propaganda that was the propaganda did seem like it was quite flashy and aimed towards to entice the youth to want to join Hitler's army. And in the movie, we see JoJo hanging up different posters or passing out flyers. And honestly, they kind of remind me of movie posters a bit. Mm-hmm. Like different kinds of movie posters you would see that would catch your eye and make you want to watch something. I think that was one of the strategies that was used to get these youth for Hitler's army, which I feel like we can see the same throughout social media now. I feel like propaganda can be shown very easily throughout social media and can be enticing to young folks just as easily as it was then, if not more easy.
I'm glad that you brought up the power of the youth, because I found this quote that was attributed to Hitler about this topic, and he said, "He alone who owns the youth gains the future." And I think that especially indoctrinating kids with propaganda can be powerful, because I feel like when you get older, the space between black and white tends to grow. There's a lot of gray areas that we see in regards to morality and just everyday life. For a kid, it's not quite as split yet. It's either, yes, this is right, or yes, this is wrong, usually. And George Orwell actually kind of mentioned a point like that in 1984. There's a reference to, I think, Winston's neighbors were ratted out by their own children because the kids were kind of drilled with the notion of these are the things that are okay and these are the things that aren't. And I think that in some ways maybe strategists for propaganda look at kids because they don't expect them to exert this critical thought yet. So I think that JoJo Rabbit does a great job of not only bringing up this point, but also showing like just how deeply a child can think. I think that's a way that people underestimate children a lot. We can see clearly how much the propaganda had affected JoJo, but also how his understanding of the gray area between wrong and right grows. I think it shows that kids are very powerful and they shouldn't be underestimated.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I feel like one of the reasons why propaganda towards children and youth works so well is because oftentimes, especially in times of crisis or war, children will feel like they don't have a lot of power, a lot of say in things. Mm-hmm. And when you are directing it all towards the children, they will feel a lot more powerful and they will feel a lot more united in the cause.
That's excellent. So one thing, I know we discussed a little bit about shifts in the movie, but one of the last questions I had for you was, one of the most powerful moments we see in the movie is at the end when JoJo's just kind of witnessing the battle going on around him. And there are a couple of shifts in the movie that go from something playful to more serious, but I feel like this was one of the more prolonged moments. Why do you think we have that shift in the movie?
That's a great question. I think that we actually can begin to see that shift more at the beginning of the movie when they have the mock battle in the camp. And in the battle, you see JoJo being panicked and like kind of running around and like kind of really scared. And you see those same emotions and reactions in the actual battle when the Americans are coming in. And I think that one big reason that that shift is in the movie is to show that JoJo really doesn't see himself as a Nazi. He really was just aligning with that because that was what was popular. And you see several times throughout the movie, he calls himself a cripple and ugly, or even like Hitler will say to him, "Oh, you're unpopular," which is because Hitler's from his own imagination. You know that JoJo thinks that about himself. And so when the battles actually happen and he looks panicked, you can see where his loyalties actually lie when he goes back to Elsa to help her escape.
I love that you brought that up because the beginning battle was actually kind of something that I didn't really pay as much attention to JoJo's reactions and stuff. So I'm glad that you brought that up because that's a really excellent point. One thing I was wondering too, I was kind of trying to analyze this. So when the war's over and JoJo goes to find Elsa, he tells her at first that Germany won. And you can see that she's absolutely devastated and she's scared and she's not sure what she's going to do next. But then she goes out to find out that the Allies have won. She sees the troops driving by, like on a truck with an American flag. Why do you think JoJo would pull a prank on her in that sort of way?
I don't know if it was necessarily a prank or more so that he was afraid to lose her. Because at this point, he has lost his mother, he's lost his sister, and his father is fighting in the war. So she is all that he has left. And I think he reacted more in a sense of fear than anything else. But I do like how I feel like he kind of repented of that by helping her escape, saying, like, I've come up with a plan to help you leave. And when they walked out the door, it was fine. And she was able to live her life freely. But I don't necessarily think he was trying to prank her in that sense.
Yeah, maybe prank wasn't the right word for that, but I think I think that it's a really great explanation because that was something that I was kind of trying to puzzle with. So thank you for explaining that. I think that's something I can kind of feel peace on in that regard. But I was curious about JoJo's sister and the dad because they're referenced to, we don't really get to see them. I kind of wish that was something we could hear more about, but I wonder if that's just sort of an allusion to all these other people that perhaps in the resistance movement ended up just never being heard from again because of the way that the Nazi Party and the Gestapo had kind of managed to, I don't want to say perfect death, but to organize death in such a way that someone could just disappear without a trace.
Yeah, so I have theories about that because with his sister, I am forgetting her name. They barely say it throughout the film. They talk about Commander K didn't know of her, but Elsa did. And so they allude to her in such a strange way that it makes me feel like maybe she was sick and she died of sickness. Like she was born sick and just like slowly like got weaker and weaker until she passed away, and that's why not many adults knew about her, which is why Elsa was able to pass as her.
Thank you. I think that's another thing I can kind of come to peace with on there too. I think a lot of times we get sort of uncomfortable when there are questions left unanswered, but I also think that that's a mark of a good movie too, when it leaves you thinking. So I want to know, just kind of before we end up closing the discussions, what are some messages or morals that you took away from the movie?
That is such a good question. There are lots of different themes that I was able to get from it. I feel like one of the most prevalent themes is love and acceptance, to love others and accept them for who they are, but also to experience things with your own eyes, to not just take people's words as doctrine, but live life and make your own judgments based off of it.
That's awesome. Thank you so much.
What about you? What did you think?
I like the notion that you brought up as well of love and acceptance. I think that that was something that showed up a lot, because I'm sure for Rosie's character, it was probably really difficult for her to come to terms with the fact that her son was really invested in Nazism, when that was something that she and her husband were very clearly trying to fight against. I think that one thing that we can really gain from it too, especially with seeing JoJo's character, is that people can learn and they can change for the better, and people don't have to be labeled in a one-dimensional way. Because if you were to read about like Commander K or something in one light, it's easy just because he's wearing the German uniform to label him as a Nazi and just kind of turn the page from there. But he has a lot of depth to his character, and JoJo could have easily slipped into that Nazi mold and been recognized as nothing more, but I like that they were able to add depth to the characters.
I feel like with adding the depth, you're able to have so many different dimensions to the characters, and it makes it a lot more interesting and a lot more realistic to when you're watching it. You can relate it more to you.
I also think, again, sort of going back to Commander K, I think that he kind of represents some of the people in the German army during that time that were there because they had to be there, because it was their duty to be there. A lot of them weren't these fanatics that wanted to exterminate people that were different from them. I don't know if you've seen this picture before, but there's a photograph of Germans that have surrendered to the American army being shown footage from concentration camps, and you can see so many of them are just absolutely horrified with what they're seeing. And I'm certainly not saying this at all to excuse the people that did play an active hand in that, but for the people that didn't know that that was going on and they were just trying to bring the war to a close as quickly as they could, I think that it's important that we remember that not everybody really had a choice in this. And we do hear some of the stories about the people that were brave enough to avoid this. I don't know if you've heard of the movie A Hidden Life, but it covers the story of a man who lived in Austria, and he was approached to join the Austrian army to fight for Germany. And he, for the past, like, since the war had started, he had really struggled with this morally, and he was talking to priests and family members and people that he trusted about whether or not it was the right thing to do, and so many of them had just said, it's so dangerous for you to do otherwise. If you stand up and do something about it, then bad things will happen to you. You could potentially be putting your family at risk too. But he ultimately stands for what he believes in, and ultimately at the cost of his own life. And I think stories like that are really admirable, but we also don't know what we would do in situations like that. We want to believe that we would stand up against what was going on, but I think a lot of people either didn't know the extent of what was going on, or they were too scared to do something about it.
Yeah, it's really hard to know what we would personally want to do in that, or how we would react to a situation like that until we've lived through something, until we've lived through a choice that we've had to make like that. And we can all say that I want to do I want to live like this. I want to fight for what is right. I want to do this, but it's not always such a clear line of what right and wrong is.
Mm-hmm.
And there's not always a choice.
And that's part of the reason why I admired Rosie's character and people like that, because like they went in knowing the risks and were able to kind of overcome whatever fear they had and in whatever way try to spread the message of what should happen and what shouldn't happen and the importance of freeing Germany from the Nazi regime.
And just giving a different perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree with you completely.
Awesome. Well, that's about all that I have for you. Thank you so much, Chlöe, for agreeing to sit and chat with me for a bit about this. I really loved hearing your insights on it, and thank you so much for all your support for the podcast and for sharing your great ideas with all of us.
Oh, it was all my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me here.
Yeah, no problem. We'll have to find some other discussion topics that we want to cover, and we'll have to get you back on here again because I just had so much fun doing this with you.
I look forward to it.
Sweet. So that's it for today. For those of you that enjoyed this episode or have enjoyed the podcast so far, as you guys know, all the different platforms are kind of different. Whether you leave a review, like, subscribe, follow, anything like that, that would mean a lot to me and that would really help boost the podcast. And if you have any ideas, recommendations for future episodes or topics that we can discuss, I'd love to hear them. And this is Tea Time Thoughts. I'm Kaylin, and I'll talk to you guys next week. Thanks.